So, I'm hesitant to use the word inevitable, although clearly I'm very bullish. But, black swans by definition are unknown unknowns, right? The future is unknowable. And so we have to be sort of reverent to that opacity of the future. There's a complete possibility that some black swan could take out Bitcoin. So I don't want anyone believing, 100% that this thing's a surefire conclusion. However, absent any unforeseen catastrophic event to Bitcoin, it does seem that game theoretically to be an extremely high probability that it will outcompete gold, as we've described. As far as government's ability to suppress its success, the governments are very effective at targeting centralized entities and regulating them. So they can go to a CEO, they can subpoena him or lock him up, or they can turn off bank accounts, or they can come to an office and turn off servers, things like that. But they've proved to be impotent at dealing with distributed computing platforms. So a good example there is like BitTorrent, which back in, I think this is the early 2000s, BitTorrent was essentially where governments would come in and shut down things like Napster, which were more centralized. BitTorrent was open source distributed software that allowed people to share media files. So you could slice and dice songs and movies into a bunch of little bits and basically just beam them anywhere in the world, and anyone could download them. And it was, it was anonymized and distributed. And every time the government would try to clamp down on it, which was largely driven by media companies were, BitTorrent was eating their lunch, so they would lobby the government to go and attack BitTorrent. Every time they would try to shut down BitTorrent in different ways, it's like a virus. It would just mutate and end up other places. And because it was open source, it could just be kind of copied and pasted and spun up again very quickly. So it's very much like whack-a-mole, right? You knock down one and 10 more pop up, or a hydra. So in that sense, distributed software is anti-fragile. And the more government tries to intervene, typically the more dispersed it becomes. And it's kind of hardened by hostility in a sense. So the Bitcoin network itself, I think, is more or less immune to government regulation. And one more wrinkle to that is that we do have this case precedent with the PGP case, where essentially the government was trying to classify PGP, which was also open source software, as munitions and regulate its trade internationally. However, the case took a turn. I think it went all the way to the Supreme Court. The case took a turn when one of the programmers printed out all of PGP's source code and set it on the table and said, "This is PGP." So in that moment, open source software was basically declared protected under freedom of speech rights. At least here in the U.S., we have the First Amendment. I know it's not everywhere, but anywhere that there is that freedom of speech is protected, we have case precedent that open source software falls under those protections. So that's another thing that makes it very difficult for the U.S. to come out and declare Bitcoin illegal. They would have to somehow amend the First Amendment, which is the cornerstone of Western civilization, frankly. So there's a very big, very tight stronghold there that would seem to be uncompromisable, but who knows? Where they can do a lot of damage, and where they do a lot of damage, are regulating the endpoints. Again, those centralized entities, largely exchanges, OTC desk, custodians, they can regulate them very tightly. And that can be an inhibition to Bitcoin adoption. So they do hold some sway over it. But again, for the reasons I've laid out earlier, I think Bitcoin, I kind of see it as liquid that gets into all the nooks and crannies of even political interest and incentives that slowly, what do they say, speculators become holders, holders become revolutionaries kind of thing. Like, it really changes your incentives as you interact with Bitcoin. And I think I think it's scale agnostic. I think it operates as much at the individual level as it does at the institutional and nation state level.